And a warm welcome to you all this evening for Local Plan webinar. Tonight's presentation will focus on the following areas. We'll focus on housing, gypsy and travellers, economy, town centres, and also infrastructure. If you have any questions on the local plan or any issues raised in the subject matters tonight, please put any questions in the chat and we'll ask the questions towards the end of the presentation. Can we bring up the presentation, please, if that's possible? Thank you, Kieran. So the agenda tonight is going to look at spatial strategy, look at new homes, housing policies, gypsy and travellers and travelling show people, town centre and retail, employment, infrastructure, next steps and questions. I'm now going to pass you over to Jane Reeves, who will take you through the spatial strategy for local plan. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and a warm welcome to everyone that is joining us this evening. I'm going to start off by giving an overview on the draft local plan spatial strategy. So a key policy in the draft local plan is the spatial strategy policy, which sets out the overall level and distribution of growth. The strategy is to focus new development within the settlement areas to the west of the borough to optimise delivery in the most sustainable and accessible areas. So whilst the government standard methodology for local housing need sets a requirement for the delivery of 327 homes per year, totalling 6,213 homes over the plan period, Surrey Heath is subject to significant environmental and planning constraints. Surrey Heath also forms part of a housing market area with the less constrained Hart District Council. Duty to cooperate discussions with Hart have confirmed their commitment to deliver 41 homes per year to 2032, so a total of 533 homes to help address housing needs in Surrey Heath. This reduces Surrey Heath's local plan requirement figure, which is the number of homes to be delivered in the borough, to 5,680 homes. The Strategic Land Availability Assessments, one of our evidence-based studies, identifies supply to meet this requirement with a 7% buffer to ensure flexibility in delivery. A significant element of the local plan strategy is to support high quality and high density development in Camberley town centre, together with about 1,200 homes at Mindenhurst and the allocation of suitable and available sites in the countryside outside of the Greenbelt. In the rural east of the borough, the delivery of new homes is focused within the villages, and Daniel will present further detail in the new homes section of this presentation. The alternative growth strategy options involve release of land from the Greenbelt. One scenario is based on a dispersed approach of releasing land on the edge of villages in the Greenbelt. The other scenario is to focus development on one large-scale site. The only large-scale site which is being suggested by developers is at Ferrex Airport. But just to stress, these two options are not part of the preferred strategy in this draft local plan, but are alternatives to the preferred approach. If you're interested in finding out more about sustainability appraisal, this information is available on our website. The spatial strategy also sets out the approach for retaining existing employment land. It recognises that Surrey Heath forms part of a functional economic area with Hart District and Rushmore Borough Councils. It plans to meet employment land needs of the borough by protecting and supporting employment uses within 17 allocated strategic and locally important employment sites. A notable exception is the proposed reallocation of the Sir William Seaman Square site in Frimley for new homes. The spatial strategy policy sets out a hierarchy of centres with Camberley Town Centre at the top and encourages a range of uses consistent with the scale and function of the centres, and also supports the regeneration of Camberley Town Centre. The strategy sets out continued protection for the Greenbelt. One change is the proposal to remove the Greenbelt wash from Chobham Village and define a revised settlement boundary. This recognises that because the village does not contribute to the openness of the green belt, it should be inset in line with other villages in the east and in accordance with national planning policy guidance. Moving on to the key diagram, this illustrates spatially the location of key allocations across the borough, including the focus of site allocations for new homes in the urban area to the west and concentration of employment areas along the Camberley to Frimley area to the far west of the borough. It also shows the significant areas of development constraint, which include the special protection areas shown in pink and covering 23% of the borough, and the 400-metre buffer zone shown in yellow diagonal lines around it, with green belt covering the east of the borough. The key diagram is included in the draft local plan, and the location of the housing allocations will be explained in more detail by Daniel later in this presentation. I'll now pass over to Daniel to talk about the new homes within the borough.
Yes, thank you very much, Jane, and good evening, everybody. So as Jane's helpfully already set out, our overall housing requirement over the plan period is currently set to be 5,680 new homes. So two key questions following from this, of course. Firstly, how are we going to deliver enough new homes to meet this requirement? And secondly, where are they going? So to answer the first question, with regard to meeting the housing requirement number, there are a number of different sources of new homes that contribute to our overall projected supply over the plan period. Firstly, as you can see in the table, the plan period begins in 2019. So there have already been 728 new homes completed within the borough since the base date of the plan, which we can count towards the housing requirement. Secondly, there are a number of sites within the borough that already have planning permission or are currently being built out, which forms a significant element of the projected supply as well. So this includes, for example, Mindenhurst development in Deep Cut for 1,200 homes. And in total, this category comprises around 43% of the overall housing requirement up to 2038. So if we take what has already been delivered since 2019 and what already has planning permission, we're already over halfway to meeting the total housing requirement already. But this means that we need to find sites for another approximately 2,500 homes on top of these to meet the requirements up to 2038. And the next key element of supply seeks to do this. This comprises sites that don't currently have planning permission, but that we have identified as available and potentially suitable for development ourselves. And this includes a number of the sites that have been allocated in the plan through policy HA1. And this comprises another 43% of the total housing requirement. And then finally, at the bottom, national policy allows us to include an allowance in our projected housing supply for windfall sites. And this essentially allows us to take account of sites that we've not been able to identify at this stage, but that are likely to come forward over the next 17 years, typically smaller sites. But overall, these sources of housing supply provide enough new homes for us to meet our housing requirement with an appropriate buffer to ensure flexibility in that supply as well. So on the next slide, in terms of the spatial distribution, the second key question was, where are these new homes going to be delivered? So the table on this slide outlines where the new homes will go in each of these categories I've just mentioned, based on their kind of general geographical area. So the first section highlighted in green, although you can't really see much of a difference between the green and the yellow sections on the table. The first section shows a number of new homes identified in the western half of our borough, which covers Backshot, Camberley, Deep Cut, Frimley Green, and Mitchett. And in total, 443 new homes have already been completed in these areas since 2019, with a further 2,231 new homes already having planning permission. And as I mentioned previously, you can see that a substantial number of these relate to the ongoing development of the former Princess Wall Barracks in Deep Cut. And then a further 2,178 new homes are identified on sites in the west of the borough, of which the majority relate to the regeneration of Camberley town centre, which we'll see later in the presentation. So the second section, which is highlighted in yellow, shows the number of new homes identified in the eastern half of the borough, covering Bisley, Chobham, Lightwater, West End, and Windlesham areas. So since 2019, 285 new homes have been completed in these areas, with a further 209 currently benefiting from planning permission. So in addition to this, a further 295 new homes have been identified on sites in these areas, of which around a third relate to the development of the Chobham Rugby Club, as we'll see later. So finally, in the blue section, which is a little bit easier to see, the non-spatial or non-geographical elements of our supply are shown as a general category. So due to the nature of windfall sites, we simply can't predict exactly where these will come forward. So our estimate based on historic trends is that another 457 new homes will come forward up until 2038 on sites we've not been able to identify at this stage. But overall, the identified housing supply provides for approximately 4,850 new homes in the western, more urban and developed half of the borough, and approximately 789 new homes in the more rural eastern half of the borough. And this reflects, as Jane set out earlier, the strategy of focusing the delivery of new homes towards available brownfield sites in the more sustainable settlement areas. So if we move on to the Borough Wide Map on the next slide, this shows where each of the sites that have not yet been completed and do not currently have planning permission at the base date of the assessment, we can see that there's a relatively even spread of sites around the borough, with the western sites being much more densely developed, as I've just set out. And now I'll talk you through some of the key site allocations and briefly outline some of the main considerations for those sites. But just before I do, it's worth quickly noting that the considerations I'm about to set out are in addition to all the other policies in the plan, which will still affect the allocated sites on top of the specific allocation policy. So if we start in Camberley Town Centre on the next slide, there are 4 key sites to note, which I'm sure you'll already be familiar with. So start in the northwest, we've got the London Road block along the A30. So this is allocated to deliver 550 net new homes, amongst other uses as well, such as retail, offices, restaurants and cafes, that sort of thing. And then south of this site, we have the former House of Fraser site, which is allocated to deliver at this stage approximately 120 new homes. And then on the eastern edge of the town centre, where we have the council offices and the Camberley Library site, which is allocated for approximately 475 new homes in total. And then finally, Camberley Station to the south, which is allocated for 75 new homes, amongst other things at this stage as well. So in line with national planning guidance, these allocations represent significant uplifts in density in relation to the existing developments, and consequently the site allocation policies focus on delivering regeneration focused outcomes, such as high quality design, both in the development itself and the public realm spaces, in order to contribute toward the wider regeneration of Camberley Town Centre as a whole. It's worth briefly noting that a specific number of homes allocated on each site may of course change throughout the plan making process, and that's to take account of updated evidence and the feedback we received during the consultation as well. So if we look at the wider Camberley area, on the next slide, there are 3 further site allocations are included. These are kind of toward the bottom of the map, and they're labelled HA1, 07, 05 and 14. And together they're allocated for another 106 homes. So the allocation policies for these sites focus on requiring development proposals to demonstrate high quality design again, and to retain and provide as much green landscaping and trees as possible. But notably, policy HA105, which is sort of the one in the middle, that requires the Camberley Adult Education Centre building to be retained and reused as part of any redevelopment, as it forms a local heritage asset. Now, if we move on to the Backshot and Windlesham site allocations, the key sites here comprise the Backshot Highways Depot at the moment, labelled at HA102, and the housing reserve site east of Heath Park Drive, which is labelled HA112, toward the right-hand side of the screen. So the key considerations at the Backshot Depot is that any development proposals would be required to be genuinely conservation-led, given the importance of some of the buildings on site, in particular the archaeology centre, of course, and it must have special regard to the retention and enhancement of the Backshot Park conservation area and its setting. And then for Heath Park Drive, the key policy requirements include the provision of a community facility on site, alongside providing significant landscaping and green spaces, kind of given the rural location it's in. So if we move on to West End and Chobham area, the key element here tonight is the inclusion of an allocation for the Chobham Rugby Club site. So key considerations for this site allocation include that the existing recreational use for the rugby club must be re-provided on another suitable site within the borough, but also that an appropriate amount of green space is required to be retained on site, and that adequate play facilities are provided on site in accordance with the council standards as well. And importantly, the allocation of 91 new homes for this site is relatively low density for the area, given the amount of land. And that's in order to account for the space that would be taken up by these other requirements as well. And then for the West End site at HA111, the key considerations here would include preserving the rural character of the area and preserving the setting of the Grade 2 listed Malt House farm and its curtilage. So if we move on to Frimley and Deepcut site allocations, we'll start with the Surrey and Siemens Square, as Jane mentioned previously. This is labelled HA109, the top left of the screen. The site is allocated for approximately 200 new homes, which are to be delivered through a high quality design-led scheme that is required to remain sympathetic to the character of the area. Key considerations include improving pedestrian and cycle linkages through to Frimley Centre and the station, and contributing to the green character of the area generally. And if we move on to the Frimhurst Farm site, which is labelled HA108, kind of in the middle of the screen at the bottom, and the key considerations include the protection and enhancement of the Basingstoke Canal conservation area and the proximity of the railway flanking the southern boundary of the site, particularly with regard to safety and noise barriers. And you may already be aware, of course, that Sturt Road site at HA110, the bottom left, and the Mindenhurst site, labelled HA4, the big one on the right-hand side, they already have planning permission at this stage. The site allocations reflect the proposals that have been adopted, essentially, which makes sure that any further or revised planning applications for these sites would still need to comply with the policy. And I'll now hand over to Olivia to take you through the remainder of the housing policies.
Thank you, Daniel. Good evening, everyone. The local plan seeks to deliver housing that meets a range of accommodation needs within the local population. Housing policies within the local plan therefore seek to provide a mix of dwelling types and sizes, with new development schemes required to provide a range of properties with varying numbers of bedrooms based on the evidenced local need, with the current local needs set out within the Housing Need Assessment 2020. Housing provided is to be accessible and adaptable for changing needs over time to allow people to stay in their homes for longer. Housing schemes are to include the provision of self-build plots, The local plan also supports the delivery of specialist housing designed for older people, disabled people, and vulnerable people with specific housing needs, to provide a choice of suitable specialty housing for varying needs based on the type of facilities required and the level of independence and support needed. Policies seek to provide a range of affordable housing, including both affordable ownership products such as shared ownership and first homes, in addition to affordable and social rent. The local plan seeks to protect existing housing stock in order to minimise net loss of dwellings, and the local plan seeks to also deliver pitches and plots to provide accommodation for gypsies and travellers and travelling show people. So the next couple of slides just give an overview of some of the housing policies which seek to address these matters. Policy H5 sets out criteria to ensure that new residential developments provide a range and mix of housing, and requires that the size and types of homes are reflective of local needs. The policy sets out the indicative mix based on the current housing need assessment. Policy H5 also sets out the specific adaptability and accessibility requirements, in addition to requirements for self-build plots on schemes of 20 or more dwellings and criteria for build-to-rent properties. Following on from that, policy H6 sets out criteria for specialist housing, including ensuring that the specialist housing is required to meet the identified needs that are evident at the time of the proposal, also that the accommodation is suited to the intended occupiers in terms of the level of support provided, with homes being accessible to local shops and services where appropriate, and also ensuring that the location of the housing would not result in an over-concentration that would change the character of an area or have a detrimental impact on the vitality and viability of town centres. As buying or renting a home on the open market is inaccessible to many local people, the local plan seeks to deliver affordable housing to assist in meeting the range of affordable housing needs within the community. In order to deliver affordable homes, the local plan includes an affordable housing policy, which requires that on development sites of 10 or more residential dwellings, or where the site area is greater than half the hectare, 40% of the total units are required to be affordable homes. This is to be provided in the form of a mix of affordable tenures, which reflect local needs, which are currently identified within the housing need assessment. The types of affordable homes the local plan seeks to deliver include subsidised rented housing, such as social rent and affordable rent, and also affordable intermediate housing, including shared ownership and first homes, which are a type of discounted market housing for first-time buyers that came into effect this year. In terms of the percentage breakdowns of affordable tenures, policy H7 sets out that 25% of the affordable housing provision is to be provided as first homes in accordance with national guidance, and the remaining affordable provision is to comprise 75% subsidised rent and 25% affordable intermediate housing. Two further policies which seek to provide affordable housing are the exception sites policies within the plan. These seek to deliver genuinely affordable housing schemes to meet local needs on suitable sites within sustainable locations that are outside of defined settlement boundaries. These are small-scale developments adjacent to settlements where it's demonstrated that that need cannot be met within the settlement boundary. As there are two exception sites policies within the draft plan, policy H9 for rural exception sites, which seeks to meet affordable housing needs within rural areas, and sets out the specific criteria which must be met in order for these sites to be permitted. Policy H10 is a further exception sites policy which relates specifically to first homes and permits delivery of first homes outside of settlements within the countryside, and also sets out the detailed criteria for these schemes. I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Kate to talk through gypsies and travellers.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Olivia. So, turning first to the approach taken in respect of gypsies, travellers and travelling show people, just as with housing needs for the settled community, national planning policy requires each local authority to make an assessment of its needs for gypsies and traveller pitches and travelling show people plots. The government expects authorities to identify as a minimum sites capable of meeting needs across the first 5 years of the plan period. The Council's Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment sets out that the Council has an identified need for 32 Gypsy and Traveller pitches and 14 travelling show people plots across the period 2020 to 2040, and the majority of that need is required in the early part of the plan period. The Council has undertaken a broad portfolio of work to try and identify sites suitable to meet those needs, which has included a detailed assessment of all Council-owned land. As a result of that work, the draft local plan has identified one proposed site allocation for 4 pitches, and this is at Diamond Ridge Woods in Camberley. The site in question lies to the north of the A30 London Road and to the southwest of Caesars Camp Road, close to the Camberley Fire Station. Unfortunately, the Council hasn't yet been able to identify any other sites suitable to accommodate Gypsy and Traveller pitches or travelling show people plots. As a result, efforts to identify further sites to meet the remaining identified needs, which is a minimum is expected to be at least 19 pitches, will need to continue through the remainder of the plan-making process. To this end, the Council's recently launched a call for Gypsy and Traveller and travelling show people sites. This is a process through which landowners and other interested parties were invited to submit sites to the Council for consideration for their suitability to accommodate Gypsy and Traveller pitches or travelling show people plots. The Council's hoping to undertake a further consultation in the later part of summer 2022, and that will hopefully identify other sites capable of meeting the borough's identified needs, and we'll be seeking comments on those. It's worth saying here that if we're unable to identify sufficient opportunities to meet our identified needs, there is a risk that the local plan could be found unsound at examination in public. Finally, to support the provision of pitches and plots to meet the Council's identified needs on a more general basis, the approach taken in the draft local plan, which we are currently consulting on, also sets out that we will seek to safeguard the existing supply of Gypsy and Traveller pitches and travelling show people plots, and sets out that development requirements against which planning applications for Gypsy and Traveller and travelling show people accommodation will be assessed. We've also set into policy a requirement for the delivery of pitches and plots on larger housing sites outside of Camberley Town Centre, which we hope will help meet at least some of the Council's identified needs. I'll now hand over to Jane to discuss retail and town centres. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. So the next couple of slides set out an overview of the draft local plan policies on town centres, as well as other smaller centres and retail uses. The purpose of these policies is to support the role and vitality of town, district and smaller centres across the borough. To support the development of these policies, the Council commissioned consultants to undertake a specific study on town centre uses, which includes uses such as shops, cafes, restaurants, services and leisure activities. And this is available on the Council's website. The study looks at factors such as national shopping trends and expenditure patterns to determine what town centre uses we might need to plan for over the period up to 2038. It also makes recommendations as to how we might do that. One of the key conclusions of the study is that we don't need to plan to allocate any additional retail shopping floor space, having regard to the existing vacancies and planning commitments. This is a very different situation to plans developed about 8 years ago, and is largely due to national trends and the increase in online shopping. The study suggests reconfiguration of the existing town centre floor space to make sure it's attractive to retailers, but also that policies should allow for a mix of uses while seeking to protect a core of retail shopping uses. Town centres are, as I'm sure you'll be aware, now seen much more as a focus for a range of social and community activities, as well as a place to live. The council-wide strategy is to prioritise the regeneration of Camberley Town Centre, and the residential proposals for the town centre outlined earlier in this presentation are a significant element of our longer-term spatial strategy, with around 1,300 new homes planned to be provided. The added activity this will bring will contribute to the vitality and viability of Camberley Town Centre. The local plan policies reflect the wider corporate strategy. The policy CTC1 is an overarching policy which seeks to provide flexibility for a mix of uses to support the vitality and viability of the town centre. In addition, policy CTC2 defines a primary shopping area where retail uses will be focused in a central shopping core area. Finally, policy CTC3 covers movement and accessibility into and around the town centre. The next slide looks more widely across the borough, and the draft local plan identifies a hierarchy of centres which is based on the facilities the centres contain and the populations that they serve. All these centres are important in providing local access to important facilities. Overall, the draft local plan seeks to encourage and protect a range of uses in these smaller centres, appropriate to their place in the hierarchy and to local character. District and local centres provide a range of retail, community and leisure uses and other services such as cafes and pubs. The draft local plan includes policies for protection and improvement to Backshot and Frimley district centres, including defining centre boundaries and identification of a primary shopping area where retail uses should be protected. Policy ER8 also defines and supports a number of local centres across the borough, including at Chobham, Frimley Green, Lightwater, Watchetts and Windlesham. Policy ER9 identifies smaller shopping areas called neighbourhood parades. There are 10 designated neighbourhood parades, and the draft local plan policy seeks to maintain and enhance the vitality and viability of these parades, which are particularly valuable in providing access to goods and services for their surrounding communities. Finally, there's a specific policy in the draft local plan recognising the benefits of regeneration improvements in Old Dean Centre. I'll now pass over to Katie to talk about the economy.
Thanks, Jane. So policies in the economy section of the local plan relate to office, research and development, light industrial and storage and distribution uses, although clearly there are many other types of employment in the borough. But for the purposes of these policies, these relate to these particular land uses. So the purpose of the policies is to ensure that an appropriate supply of land and buildings for future employment use is protected and supported for economic growth. In order to assess how much employment land is needed over the plan period, consultants and the council undertook forecasting work, which is set out in an employment technical paper, which is available on our website. This assessed future employment floor space needs and land requirements for employment uses over the plan period, and it also identified and assessed employment sites within the borough. The overall conclusion of the study was that future employment needs can broadly be met through the existing supply. So, for example, this includes through the intensification of existing employment areas, and therefore that there was no need for further employment land allocations in the local plan. So turning to the economy policies, these, as Jane has set out, these seek to ensure an appropriate supply of employment land by identifying 17 sites as either strategic or locally important employment areas. Policies ER1 to ER3 in the local plan set out the approach to development in these areas, which is broadly to support economic development and to seek to protect them for economic uses, unless there are no strong economic reasons to do so. Policy ER1 also seeks to encourage units for small and micro businesses, as almost 90% of our businesses fall within this category. In addition, ER1 also seeks to encourage developers to consider employment and skills plans, which would deliver local construction training opportunities. The plan includes a specific policy on Yorktown Business Park, recognising and supporting its role as the largest employment site in the borough. There's also a specific policy supporting economic growth in the rural community, recognising the more sensitive location of those businesses. And finally, policy ER6 recognises and supports the role of Frimley Park Hospital as both the borough's largest employer, but also its significance in providing healthcare facilities, whilst also recognising some of the local issues that are related to its location. And finally, just to note, that whilst the local plan is about land uses, there are other ways in which the council can support economic growth. And this is largely supported through the work of the council's economic development team. So I'm now going to talk about policies in the infrastructure chapter. There's a number of strands to infrastructure planning related to the local plan. First is to ensure that appropriate infrastructure is provided alongside new development. And for example, this might include the provision of green space or highway improvements and could be delivered either directly on site by the developer or through financial contributions. Secondly, the local plan also has a role to play in protecting existing facilities by setting policies relating to, for example, their reuse or redevelopment. We'll cover that in a bit more detail in the next slide. And finally, related to the first point, the local plan and supporting evidence must be able to demonstrate that the infrastructure needed to support the overall amount and location of development set out in the local plan can be delivered. The three pieces of evidence that I briefly wanted to highlight, although there are others that are relevant to the provision of infrastructure, such as an open space study, which is available on our website. So firstly, consultants were commissioned to undertake a baseline infrastructure assessment that looked at the existing situation of infrastructure provision across the borough and highlighted some potential issues. Secondly, this draft local plan consultation is supported by a draft infrastructure delivery plan. This updates some of the information in the baseline study, but also looks at the provision of different types of infrastructure to support development. Input from this draft local plan consultation from infrastructure providers will support the next version of the IDP. And although some high-level engagement has already taken place with them, the detailed responses we get back to this consultation and further discussions will help inform the next version of the IDP and the next version of the local plan. Probably important to note that the IDP is a mechanism to identify the future infrastructure requirements of the development proposed in the local plan. It will not necessarily seek to address existing deficiencies in infrastructure provision, although this will obviously be relevant in determining what additional infrastructure is required. It's also important to note that most infrastructure is provided by other partners. So for example, Surrey County Council's Local Education Authority and the Highway Authority and the clinical commissioning groups in terms of providing health facilities. Infrastructure needs will therefore be guided by the responses we receive from those providers. And finally, a transport assessment is currently underway and being undertaken by Surrey County Council that will look at the highway impacts of the proposed spatial strategy and if and how any significant impacts on the highway network can be mitigated. This will inform the next version of the local plan and the infrastructure delivery plan. So turning to the infrastructure policies, there are a number of detailed policies on different types of infrastructure. IN1 is an overarching policy seeking to ensure that development mitigates the impacts it creates on existing infrastructure provision or new infrastructure provision. IN2 relates to the provision of highways and transport infrastructure, and IN3 seeks to ensure that the most up-to-date digital infrastructure is provided alongside new development. However, the building regulations are currently being changed, meaning that some of this will now be a legislative requirement, so we may need to review the wording of this policy. Community facility policy, as well as supporting the provision of new facilities, also seeks to protect existing facilities unless certain criteria are met, such as a period of marketing for community uses. And finally, there's a suite of policies relating to the provision of green infrastructure and open space and recreational facilities, and these both seek to protect existing facilities and set out the standards for providing new facilities alongside new development. And finally, on the right-hand side of this slide, we've just listed here some types of infrastructure that will be considered alongside the local plan. We've touched briefly on transport and highways, including pedestrian and cycle routes. And you may be aware that because of the proximity of the protected heathlands, the Thames Basin Heaths to Surrey Heath, all net new residential developments have to provide an alternative form or financial contributions towards an alternative form of open space known as suitable alternative natural green space. Clearly, health and education are also important infrastructure facilities that we'll need to consider, as well as the provision of utilities and the protection and provision of green infrastructure. I'm now going to hand on to Gavin.
Thank you, Casey, for that. So in terms of future consultation events, we have another webinar on the 28th of April, which is this Thursday at 7 o'clock. And we'll be covering climate change, environment, green belt, countryside, design and heritage. That basically brings this first webinar to a close, but we got some questions which have been put in the group chat, which I'll read out. And we'll ask the panelists to answer the questions. The first question. Okay. Is Sir Siemens Square going to be demolished? Those 4 office blocks were only refurbished a few years ago. And there was a second question about where will the access roads be into the east of Knoll Road block for 425 homes? Daniel, did you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I'm more happy to take that one. Thank you, Gavin. They're quite handily batched up because the answer is relatively similar for both. So with the Sir William Siemens Square site, it's estimated to come forward in the next kind of 6 to 10 years. And the land east of Knoll Road site is kind of 11 to 15 year period. So both of these developments are anticipated to come forward, some years off. So we are at the kind of early stages of plan making. So we don't have the kind of on the ground details in terms of kind of access road for land east of Knoll Road, for example, but it may well be that the planning application comes forward either utilising an existing kind of access road, or it may be that the site could be better accommodated by an alternative access road. So the kind of western half of that site will be accessed from Knoll Road at some point. And then the other end of the site, the former Portisbury School, will of course be most likely accessed off of Hillside, but how that looks on the ground, exactly, not entirely sure at this stage. And similar for the Sir William Siemens Square site, as you mentioned, it's recently refurbished, so the site's anticipated to reuse the existing buildings at this stage, but the site allocation policy doesn't prescribe how it should come forward necessarily, so that there is flexibility for the landowner to bring something forward as they see appropriate for the site as well.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. Next question is, with the vast residential regeneration in Camberley, do we expect any improvement in public transport, specifically rail connections to from the train station? I was going to ask Jane to answer that question.
Thank you, Gavin. So we are very supportive of improving rail links from Camberley through to London and supporting improvements to the rail service. And we are equally supportive of encouraging better public transport into the rail station itself. So in terms of any development proposals that come forward within Camberley Town Centre specifically, we will be looking to see where enhanced provision could be made. There is a site-specific allocation relating to the station site itself, with a potential option for residential development on that site and potential options for improvement to the station facilities as well. So the local plan itself is very supportive of sustainable travel, and we're working together with Surrey County Council as the local highways authority to support improvements to public transport provision wherever possible.
Thanks, Jane, for that. Next question is about Chobham, re-insetting Chobham Village from the Green Belt. Will the Little Heath nursery site, open brackets, Garden Drive at Orchard Court, close brackets, retain its rural exemption site status if it is part of the inset as proposed? Currently it is outside a settlement area. Kate, can you answer that question, please?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, happy to answer that. So land at Garden Drive and Orchard Court does, as you say, currently fall within the green belt. Under the draft local plan, it's proposed that it will form part of the settlement area and it will be removed from the green belt. But that itself would not affect the affordable status of the properties on those roads. That's secured by legal agreement, and removing it from the green belt wouldn't have any impact on that whatsoever. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, for that. Next question, what provision is being made for low-cost property, storage and land for small businesses? Basic sites such as Frimhurst Farm going to developers means another local provision for fledgling businesses has gone. Katie?
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. I'm not aware that this is a particular issue that's been raised with us before, so it's really interesting to see it, and it's something that we'd welcome sort of evidence on through the local plan process. We will be doing some more evidence base on our future employment needs, particularly in the light of impact of COVID. So that's something we could definitely pursue as part of that evidence base. Clearly, policies relating to the rural economy would potentially support additional sites subject to compliance with other local plan policies on that issue. So yeah, I think that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for that. A really useful presentation by someone in the group chat. Is 10% buffer sufficient? How does that compare with buffers provided in other local plans? Daniel?
Yeah, well, happy to take that one, thank you. So I assume this relates to the housing supply tables that I discussed earlier in the kind of overall housing supply that we have in relation to the housing requirement. So before discussing the purpose of the supply buffer itself, it's just kind of quickly worth noting that so part of the process of preparing the local plan is that it must be examined by an independent planning inspector on behalf of the government before the plan can be adopted. During said examination, our projected housing supply that we've identified within the local plan will be assessed to determine its robustness. And although it's by no means a requirement, it's common practice for local authorities to identify enough sites to provide slightly above the housing targets in order to provide that buffer. As you mentioned, it's 7% for us. But importantly, said buffer is not considered to be a surplus in the usual sense of the word, but rather it's considered beneficial to provide additional flexibility in the supply to ensure that that housing requirement is met over the plan period. So, for example, it's possible, of course, that not all of the identified housing sites will be delivered within the plan period, as it is also possible that some sites, may be developed for slightly fewer homes than anticipated once the detailed planning application is assessed. So each local authority that includes a supply buffer will propose a buffer that's appropriate to the local circumstances of the authority's area. And this means that, as the question alludes to, there's quite a range of buffers coming forward in different areas. And examples that we've seen anywhere from kind of 0% up to sort of 40%. So they can range quite widely. But again, it's kind of as long as it's appropriate to the context of the authority's area, it is appropriate. So our projected housing supply buffer is currently 7% over the requirement, but given the local circumstances for Surrey Heath, it's considered to be appropriate and quite healthy as well. However, of course, there is a possibility that throughout the plan making process, this figure could go both up or down as the evidence is updated and progress is made towards bringing some of the sites forward for development. So it's not set in stone. Hopefully that's sufficient to cover that one for you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that helpful answer. Thank you very much. A question on employment. Will COVID-19 have an impact on employment needs, and how has that been taken into account? Katie?
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. That's a really good question, and one that we don't actually know the answer to at the moment. I mentioned a moment ago that we'll be updating the employment evidence base, and part of that will be to reflect what we know about the likely impact of COVID-19 on how people work. And that will then feed into the next version of the local plan.
Thank you for that. How will the local plan influence development at Deep Cut? Jane?
Thanks, Gavin. Happy to answer that question. So the planning permission has already been granted for development at Deep Cut for the delivery of about 1,200 new homes and infrastructure associated with that. So the draft local plan does include a site-specific policy for Deep Cut, and that sets out specific development criteria, which basically reflect the terms of the planning permission which has been granted. So, for example, the policy requires delivery of high quality environment reflecting the rural character of Deep Cut's setting, requires delivery of affordable housing in accordance with the permission granted, and a phased delivery of supporting social, physical and community infrastructure. So that includes for sort of health, education and sports facilities. And there's also a requirement set out in the policy to reduce the impact of traffic upon and arising from Deep Cut, and that includes improved public transport, safe footpaths and cycle routes, and some improvements to the surrounding highways network. Hope that addresses that question.
Thank you, Jane. Another question about housing. The local plan recognises challenges associated with the ageing population. Should the local plan be more proactive in seeking to deliver the evidence needed for specialist housing? I was wondering, ask Olivia that question, if possible.
Sorry, just a moment.
Shall I help out with
Oh, yeah,
that?
sorry, can I just pass that over to Jane?
Yeah, that's fine. So we have got a number of evidence-based studies which seek to inform the needs for specialist housing within Surrey Heath. One of the studies is the housing needs assessment, and that's got a specific section within it which does identify the needs of the ageing population. We've also got a specific policy on specialist accommodation, but it would be really interesting to hear from the person through representation whether you felt there's even more that we should be doing to specifically address these needs. Obviously, we're aware that it is a growing need, and there has been quite a lot of provision already, specifically within and around Camberley town centre, to help address these needs. But any further evidence that could be submitted, we'd be very interested to look at further.
Thank you, Jane, for that
question. Thank
you. A question on SANG. Is there enough SANG to mitigate the number of homes planned in the local plan? Kieran?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that one. So there's been 3 key opportunities for additional SANG capacity that have been identified through the planning process. And together these could meet the need identified for the local plan. So the first is additional capacity at Diamond Ridge Wood SANG, with a change in the site area and some site enhancements. The second is additional capacity at Shepherd's Meadows SANG, with the opportunity for a potential extension to that site, which is in Bracknell. And the third opportunity is potential to obtain SANG capacity from Bracknell from private SANGs. The council also is continuing to look for opportunities within the borough, but due to the urban nature of the west of the borough, where the greatest need is, it can be quite challenging to find sites that would meet needs, but we continue to look at opportunities to do this. More information is available in the Thames Basin Heath Special Protection Area topic paper, which is available on our website. Hopefully that covers it, Gavin.
Thank you, Kieran. A couple of questions on housing. So what's the lapse rate and why does it take homes away from the supply? Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. Happy to take that one. So again, I assume this relates back to the housing supply tables that I discussed earlier. So in essence, a lapse rate takes account for the non-delivery of sites that have planning permission. So it's generally considered to be good practice to take account of this when establishing the kind of projected housing trajectory to ensure that your projected supply is as robust as possible. So nationally, around 10% of all homes that gain planning permission are not actually delivered. So however, our data shows that within Surrey Heath Borough, historically, the non-delivery or lapse rate of all homes that are granted planning permission is 3%. So therefore, we've applied a 3% lapse rate to the sites within our projected supply that currently have planning permission, but have not yet started the build out of that permission, as those are the sites more likely to lapse. And this equates to a total of 16 homes, which have been subtracted from the commitments section accordingly. Hopefully that covers that for you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that question, for the answer, sorry. Next question, I was going to go to housing again, but I'll go on to infrastructure. More development will bring more cars. What is the council doing about encouraging people to walk and cycle more? Katie?
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. So the council is very supportive of increasing opportunities for people to walk and cycle, and will work jointly with Surrey County Council and developers where appropriate through the planning process to support the provision of improved cycle and pedestrian provision. Also worth noting that in conjunction with Surrey County Council, the council is funding the development of a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, which will cover the whole borough, and that work's just about to start. Improvements to cycling and walking are also part of the council's 5-year strategy, and there's a specific scheme for a new cycle link between Camberley and Frimley, which is being progressed by Surrey County Council. They're looking at the feasibility of that route, and will be pursuing funding options if that looks like it should go ahead. So, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. A few more questions before we wrap up the presentation. Another question on housing. We shouldn't be developing on our green fields. Why can't you just put all the housing on brownfield sites? Daniel?
Yeah, happy to take this one. Thank you again. Really good question. I'm sure we can all empathise with this in the current environmental context. It's a question we've had many times come up. So, well, the simple answer is that there aren't enough brownfield sites to meet the housing requirement up to 2038. The spatial strategy we've developed within the local plan prioritises new development in the most sustainable areas, which is on brownfield sites in the town centre and the other built up areas in the borough. So you can see the effect of this in the numbers that I outlined earlier in the tables. Of the 2,500 additional new homes we need to identify on sites that don't already have planning permission, almost half of these are allocated as part of the regeneration of Camberley town centre alone. However, in order to allocate a site for development, the site must meet a number of tests, and these are set out in national planning guidance. So importantly, this includes a test of availability, which means that the council must be able to demonstrate that the landowner is committed to providing new homes on their sites over the next 15 years. So therefore, we can't simply allocate sites just because we think there would be great sites for new homes, as much as we would love to do so. But ultimately, there are simply not enough existing brownfield sites in the borough that meet the various tests set out in national guidance. Once we have maximised the capacity from the sites in the most sustainable locations which do meet those tests, which we have sought to do so, we're then required to look at the next sequentially preferable areas for the remainder of the housing sites, which may, of course, include greenfield sites within that. So hopefully that's answered that sufficiently.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. A question on affordable housing. How achievable is the requirement of 4% affordable housing on major developments? Olivia?
Thank you, Gavin. So the affordable housing policy sets out a figure of 40%. And this will be subject to review following a whole plan viability study, and the percentage we're going to seek within the affordable housing policy will reflect what comes through from that viability report. And once the plan is adopted, where viability concerns are raised in relation to development schemes coming forward through the planning application process, any viability constraints would need to be demonstrated by robust evidence, including an independent viability assessment.
Thank you, Olivia, for that. A couple more questions. Do you see the town centre supporting an evening and nighttime economy with additional housing proposed? Jane?
Thanks, Gavin. Happy to take that one. So obviously the nature of town centres is changing, and the local plan seeks to recognise that. Seeks to understand that we're moving to more of a kind of leisure destination with kind of cafes, restaurants, leisure uses, other activities playing a greater role in supporting the vibrancy of town centres. So we feel moving forward that nighttime uses as well as evening uses will play an increasingly important role in the regeneration of Camberley Town Centre. And we feel that the provision of more homes within Camberley Town Centre will also help support its regeneration, as well as the evening and nighttime economy, and supporting more footfall within the centre itself.
Thank you, Jane. And staying with yourself, Jane, one final question here. Is a London Road block being redeveloped, and why are you putting a 50-storey block of flats on that site in Camberley Town Centre?
Thank you for that question, Gavin. So in terms of Camberley Town Centre, we have got a range of policies which cover strategic sites, and the London Road block is obviously one of the key site allocations within the town centre. As I've just mentioned, the nature and form of town centres is changing, and it's moving away from a retail focus through to a broader leisure experience, with restaurants and other supporting uses being increasingly important. And the focus of development on the London Road block will be moving forward a residential-led development rather than the retail focused development which was proposed previously. In parallel to the local plan work, the council is also undertaking a major piece of work looking at regeneration options for Camberley Town Centre, and a new strategy is in the process of being developed. And the council is also looking at developing new specifications for the London Road block itself as part of further work, and all of this is being undertaken in parallel with development of the local plan, and will feed into the local plan itself as it progresses through subsequent stages. In addition, the local plan also includes a site-specific policy specifically aimed at supporting redevelopment of the London Road block, and it includes comprehensive residential-led mixed-use development, and places real importance on high-quality design as part of that. Moving on to the point about 15-storey blocks in Camberley Town Centre, the spatial strategy does set out that the most sustainable location for new development is in accessible locations which are well supported by services and infrastructure. And obviously the town centre is a really sustainable location within the borough. Building new homes will support regeneration plans for Camberley town centre and its vitality and viability. The local plan sets out that buildings should be an appropriate scale, height and massing, and on average 4 to 7 stories in height. But we do identify within the London Road Block policy itself that there is the potential to create 2 landmark buildings of a maximum building height of about 15 stories, but that would only be acceptable from a planning perspective where this reflects good urban design. It's also important to note that elsewhere the policy identifies, say for example, for the High Street, the maximum building height should only be 3 stories to complement the historic Edwardian Victorian character. So it's very much a case of responding to the specific areas of the town centre and what would represent good urban design. I hope that addresses that issue.
Thank you, Jane. That brings to a close our Q&A session this evening. I'd like to thank the panelists for their contribution tonight. I'd like to remind everyone that we have another